So today is our first professional development seminar for the Disabled Archaeologists Network. And this is a relatively new organization that we just, we're sort of just getting started in the last couple of years. And you can find out more about us at our website, which I've just linked to in the chat. The recording of this webinar will also be hosted on the website so that you can send it to folks who might find it useful. And so today we're talking about how to find a field school and negotiate the accommodations you might need on that field school. This is the first in a series. We're hoping to have 2 more this spring, so keep your eye out for those. I will be moderating. We have 3 panelists. We have some questions to get us started, and then we're going to open it up to questions from participants. You can write your questions in the chat. You can private chat them to me if you'd like me to read them anonymously. Or I'll let you raise your hands and I can call on you if you'd like to say your question out loud. Any of those are fine. I just realized that I had not turned on the captions. I have turned on the captions and I apologize for that. So I'm excited to sort of start this conversation, and I hope that it's useful. I'm noticing from the names that I recognize of attendees that we have a lot of people who may not be students looking for field schools themselves, but I notice some people who may be mentoring students or maybe running their own field schools. So I'm hoping that this is useful sort of across the board and thinking about how to get students onto field schools that work for them and how to make the field school experience successful for students with disabilities. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. I guess in alphabetical order, my last name, Dr. Katrina Eichner, she, her, is a historical archaeologist whose research focuses on feminist and queer archaeological interventions, public heritage, and expressions of social identity in the American West. She's currently an assistant professor and director of anthropology graduate studies at the University of Idaho and co-runs Idaho Public Archaeology. And I will put a link that she provided in the chat there if you would like to learn more about Idaho Public Archaeology. Our second panelist is Dr. Alex Fitzpatrick, she, her, is a zooarchaeologist and current research officer at the Enabled Archaeology Foundation. She's also co-host of the Archaeoanimals podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network and can be found blogging at animalarchaeology.com. So putting that link in the chat. Mason Shrader is a classics and anthropology master's student at Texas Tech University and uses he, him pronouns. His work contextualizes the ancient Roman skeletal record through frameworks of critical disability theory. He has co-authored a chapter with Debbie Sneed about accessibility in archaeological fieldwork in an eventually forthcoming volume on archaeological ethics for the annual series of the American Society of Overseas Research. I'm also a contributor to that volume and can say that this chapter is brilliant and I cannot wait for it to come out so I can send it to everyone I know, rather than telling everyone I know to ask Debbie and Mason to send it informally, which is what I've been doing. I am Laura Heath-Stout. I also use she, her, and I use mixed social science methods to study the demographics of and knowledge production of archaeology as a discipline and to advocate for a more inclusive and rigorous archaeology. My book is forthcoming from Routledge. So Mason and I are both on the leadership team of the Disabled Archaeologists Network as well. So I'm gonna start us with a sort of basic question, which is for each of us, what kinds of field schools have you attended? How did you find them? And how did you choose which ones to go to? Did you need disability accommodations? And if so, how did you go about arranging for them? So basically tell us about your field school experience. Is there anyone who wants to be the one to go first? I didn't choose in advance who I was going to put on the spot.
I'll go. And I I have a learning difference, and I went to field school in 2008, something like that. And so I did not choose to disclose my learning difference or ask for accommodations, not that I hadn't been getting them in college in all of my other classes. But I found that trying to navigate the bureaucracy at the university I was at was so difficult that I did not want to add an additional step to the difficulty of going to an international field school and navigating another university's system. There were definitely times where, like we had papers that were due for my field school. It would have been nice to have had the accommodations I was used to, especially around things like reading and writing for me. But I just kind of hung on for dear life and made it work for me without the accommodations.
What were some of the factors about the particular field school you chose that made you pick that one?
So I had to have a certain amount of credits transfer back to my home institution. The field school to count towards my major had to be a certain period of time. And so that actually really limited the number of field schools that I could go to. I ended up actually going to my field school through UCLA because the credits would transfer. It was really expensive, I'll give you that much to do it that way. And I didn't know what I know now about field schools, and in particular, like looking for local field schools, and things closer to my home institution, that I wish I had known at the time.
I can go next. So the first field school I went to was in Mexico with my undergrad anthropology advisor, who sort of, I think it was like sophomore year, so 2016. And we had sort of already had this conversation in our sort of advising relationship of like what I would be comfortable doing in the field and what I wouldn't. And so I already kind of had that rapport, and he was already very sort of open to any accommodations I would need for my disability. And so that was kind of my first field school experience, and I sort of naively assumed it was representative. And then the next summer rolled around, and as I said in my bio, I'm a Mediterranean archaeologist, so I wanted to do work in the Mediterranean. So I started sort of applying to field schools with people I didn't know in the Mediterranean. And the first 3 field schools I applied to basically all sort of turned me down on the basis of that they weren't sure how my disability would work, or they were worried that my disability would be a liability, right? Things like this kind of language. One of them called my advisor, asked him to make sure that, asked him to vouch for me, and then called my doctor, and then I never heard back from him. So after lots of applications, I finally kind of landed on one, and it ended up being sort of in the Mediterranean, but not very accommodative at all. And so my sort of mode going forward to finding field schools after that, I've been to several since then, has always been to meet the director beforehand via Zoom or in person at a conference or something, and have this conversation that I had with my advisor, right, prior, of what I am comfortable with, here's what I can do, here's what I can't. And that has sort of made the whole experience, I think, easier for people to sort of see what I'm capable of, but also for me to communicate my needs for accommodation more directly than just on an application in email. So that's kind of what I do. So.
Yeah, so I can jump in as well. So when I went to field school in 2014, I don't want to make anyone feel old or anything. I'm a child. So yeah, I went to field school in 2014. It was also the first time I've ever been abroad. And I was doing my undergraduate in Hunter College in Manhattan. So basically you had to go abroad if you were going to do field school while I was at that university. There was nothing really in Manhattan, of course, as far as field schools. The other ones I looked at were all really far away. So, you know, it was basically like what was cheapest at that point. But I'd also, at the time, I was getting really interested in like Viking Age archaeology and British archaeology and kind of, you know, British prehistory. So, you know, going to the United Kingdom sounded great. At the same time, I was also pre-diagnosis of a lot of things. I didn't have healthcare at the time. I spent most of my life just not really seeing doctors because I just couldn't afford it. So I'd known in the back of my mind there was something off. I knew that I was probably dealing with depression that was getting more and more severe. Turns out if you don't go on medication, that can happen. And I also knew there's something going on with my joints. I was struggling with mobility more than I used to. But, you know, I wanted to do field school. And, you know, I think there's also, especially in field school, you kind of have that, like, I want to show myself. I'm going to show off I'm an archaeologist. So I didn't really ask for anything. I was just like, I'll do it, whatever. I was very fortunate. The site I worked on, our site director was disabled. So there were already, and you know, this was like, I think the 5th year of them running this field school. So they already had kind of measures in place to, you know, make going in and out of the site a little bit more accessible. So that was great for me. Although I was told near the end, because one of the supervisors noticed I kept dropping things, and I was like, oh, I have carpal tunnel in both hands. And he was just like, you should have told us that. Like, that would have been important to tell us. And it's one of those things you just don't think about. So I learned very quickly that asking was probably really important. And obviously there are other factors at hand. I was working internationally. I didn't know any of these people. I didn't know the university that was running it at all. Ooh, and I froze. So I'll stop there. Hi.
Your video froze, but we could hear you the whole time. So
Oh, okay. So you heard me go, oh. But yeah, no, it's basically as far as kind of my field school story.
yeah, so I can briefly share mine as well. I first went on field work in the summer in high school, actually. Which, you know, I had part of that was facilitated by class privilege, and very parents who were supportive, both financially and emotionally supportive of my desire to become an archaeologist. I went on the same field school that Kat did in 2008, it was. Although I've always been disabled, I haven't always thought of myself as disabled. And so I did not ask for accommodations, and I've sort of come to an understanding of myself as disabled more recently since, and I haven't actually been to the field in a typical archaeological setting since then. I plan to do future field work in the United States for a variety of reasons, and I expect that will make things easier. The primary way my disability manifests in the field is around sleep. I have sleep apnea, which means I need a machine, an electrical machine, in order to breathe while I sleep. If I don't have it, I both snore, which is a big problem when you're sharing a room with like 13 people. I think it was on the field school Kat and I went to. So I was probably keeping her up at night. And also I am exhausted when I don't use it. And so before I had the diagnosis and the machine, it was just often a big social problem, social stigma around it. And then once I had the machine, there were field schools I went to where I did not have electricity and I went without, and it did not occur to me that was that living in a place with electricity would actually be something I could have asked for. And in retrospect, everywhere that I have been to the field, either I was sleeping in a place that had electricity, or I was sleeping in a place that had a generator that was only on for part of the time, but I could have said, I need the generator to be on all night, or things like that. And it was possible. Everywhere I went, it was possible. And I just didn't know that was something I could or should be asking for. Then I married a disability rights organizer, and now I know my rights. But I think I would have done better work in the field if I had been able to sleep well. I think my social relationships in the field would have been better if I hadn't been keeping other people up with my very loud snoring. And I think I just would have felt more comfortable and supported if I had asked. And I really think that any of the people I worked with would have been willing to make that happen. I just didn't communicate that was what I needed, because it didn't occur to me that I was entitled to do so. So yeah, in future I wouldn't do that, but now I'm also much more established in the field than I was as a teenager and person in my 20s. So. Yeah, so our next question is, have you ever been staff or director on a field school or field project? And what was your experience with supporting disabled students? I think Kat may be the only person who's done this. Maybe Mason or Alex, you've been staff, but I think Kat is the only person who's been a director. So I might put her on the spot first.
That's absolutely fine. So yeah, I've been running field schools for over the last decade, all in the United States. I think that's worth mentioning, but some of them away from my home institution and some of them very, very close to my home institution. There are a number of things that I think we need to think about in supporting students with disabilities and differences. I think the first thing we need to think about is the fact that field school is not quote unquote normal conditions. It is high energy, high physical demand, high stress. People's schedules are very much so thrown off, and they're thrown into uncomfortable situations, even for students who do not experience ability difference. And so it's worth thinking about that, that you are putting people into a stressful environment, and even under the best circumstances, you need to think about how to support your students when facing environmental stress. I have had students come to field schools with a whole host of disabilities and differences, everything from learning disabilities, autism, mental health conditions like PTSD, anxiety, depression, degenerative neuromuscular diseases, blindness, hearing loss, even things dealing with allergies and dietary concerns, respiratory and cardiac conditions, the whole gamut. And I think, frankly, that just means that I've had a student population that is representative of the general population, which to me means that I'm actually serving our students and not necessarily creating conditions that are excluding students from our field. I do a number of things in designing my field schools. One of the first things I think about is just accommodations. As lovely as international travel and camping remotely can be, and a lot of students want those experiences, I try to recreate typically the living conditions that my students are used to in the field as much as possible. Obviously, there are limitations to that, but hot showers, electricity, a real bed, I think are important. Access to a kitchen, I think, is important for our students. I've done that, one, by getting grant money to be able to put students in dormitories and hotels and that sort of thing. I also have run field schools locally where students can just stay home. And that is an aspect of their field experience that they do not actually have to worry about, of kind of like, what are my living conditions going to be? And how is that going to affect my disability? I also, though, think about in the field itself, what are some of the things that I can preemptively do that's just going to make field work more accessible to everybody, along with then on an individual basis, meeting people's needs. I think one of the things we really need to think about as professionals is not assuming that our own experiences or the quote unquote norm of field work is necessarily the best way of doing field work. Just because you were subjected to an ultra grueling field school doesn't mean that's the only way to do field work. So, you know, making sure that you're being humane in designing your field day. Are you giving people opportunities to rest? Are you willing to actually listen when students say, you know, like, it's too hot for me, I need to pause for a second, I need to alter the schedule because it's not meeting my needs right now? Being flexible in the field with kind of what your expectations are can be really important. I also think of things, you know, I make sure that I have multiple resources for students, that they're getting information from me in a lot of different formats. So they have access to materials before we're in the field if they need more time with them. They get oftentimes written materials. They'll get in-person instruction from me. Sometimes they'll even have access to things like videos where if they need more time with training materials, they can have them. I don't know, I think there's like a lot of different ways that I could go with this question. So maybe I'll just switch to how do I deal with students when they're asking for accommodations. And so again, I've clearly kind of had students with a whole host of different needs. I have found that signposting myself as being somebody who students should feel comfortable to come and talk to and ask for the accommodations is really important. In advertising my field schools, I make it clear that like I'm a feminist queer archaeologist who you know, has a learning difference myself. I want to meet student needs as much as possible and increase diversity in the field. And so just like having that be who I am as a person running a project immediately kind of signals to my students, oh, this might be somebody I can talk to. I also like to explicitly ask my students at various points in the process what accommodations they might need. So on my field school application, I ask, are there accommodations you think you might need for field work? And give them the opportunity. If they choose to self-identify at that point, I normally set up a phone call, face-to-face conversation, even just an email if that's more comfortable for them, to talk through what do they think they need, what can I provide, and then based on that information, are there other things that I personally can think of in the field that might help them? So it's not just what they ask for. I think of additional accommodations to offer them because I have the benefit of having been in the field before. And again, I think with this too, though, you have to be a little cautious of not assuming that because somebody needs a particular set of accommodations that they can't do other things. So again, I like to just be really transparent from the get-go of what field work looks like, but also what is doable to alter field work to meet my students where they need to be met.
Yeah, I think that sort of assuming a lack of competence overall is a huge problem that a lot of disabled archaeologists have faced. And in my own research about and interviews with disabled archaeologists, a common theme has been about concern about disclosure is, for those of us who have a choice, is that like if I disclose my disability, people might think that I can't do anything, and I want to prove myself that I can do things. And so that's or for people who have disclosed, having people then treat you like you can't do anything. Yeah, and that's also intersected with gender for a lot of people, where I've heard from a lot of women, including a lot of non-disabled women, like, people won't let me carry my own buckets, for example, is a big one. And so there's this need to prove yourself if you're anything other than Indiana Jones. And that can be really hard if there are actual tasks that you're not able to do, to sort of be open about that. It can be really difficult. Yeah, so the third question I want to ask before we open it up to questions from participants is, what advice do you have for field school directors to make their field schools more accessible and inclusive? So I think we can learn from what Kat has said, but all of us, maybe from our experiences as students on field schools, is there any advice that you things that you would want people to know? I think my own is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, Zoom, it's wonderful. I was just going to say that I think it's rather cliche, but I think it's appropriate that oftentimes, and this is true with so much of academia, but especially in the field, when you're worried about so many other things, directness of communication is valuable, right? Saying directly, like you were saying, Kat, the sort of signposting that you are someone you can talk to, right, as a director, is something that doesn't often get communicated in the field because we're all running around trying to do so many other things. And so what has been the field schools that have worked best for me have been those moments where the director, before we really get into the thick of the season, says, hey, if anybody needs anything at all, whether that be disability related or otherwise, has any concerns about accommodation on any level, let's talk. I'm open to anything, because that's the reality of field work. I mean, I kind of say this over and over again, like, all of us need accommodations on some level when we're in the field, right? This is how field work functions. It's a team sport. We all play it together, right? And we can't do archaeology without mutual accommodation. And so I think if board directors understood that explicitly and then applied that to, like I say, sort of offering these direct lines of communication that seem so obvious but are so rarely done. That's my number one bit of advice. So.
And yeah, I mean, so I guess there's two things that I've kind of been already touched upon, but one thing that I hear a lot from people is, I don't know how to do that. I don't know like where to start. And obviously people are running accessible excavations already. Obviously, Katrina just spoke about her experience here in the UK. We have the Harlexton dig that's been going on, the Harlexton Field School, that has been purposely running an inclusive field school that's being supported by the Enabled Archaeology Foundation, which I guess is kind of the sister network here in the UK to the Disabled Archaeologists Network. So things are happening. Teresa O'Mahony, who kind of coined the term enabled archaeology here in the UK and has sadly passed, but she's done so much work. There's guides available that tell you how to run an accessible field school. So at this point, there's not really much excuse besides maybe funding. But other than that, like, there's stuff written that can tell you how to go about a lot of these things. And then the other thing that I think has been talked about a bit is that I think there's just needs to be a shift in the culture of excavation in general. It's something that I've kind of talked about when I talk about mental health and excavating and, dealing with mental illness like I have. While you excavate, there's such a, gung-ho kind of very toxic masculinity type of attitude sometimes where, it's, you got to do all this work and it doesn't matter if it hurts. And actually, if it hurts and if you feel horrible doing it, then that's good. That's real archaeology that we kind of have to move aside from, because no one wants to be miserable doing this. And let's be honest, a lot of us don't get paid enough to be miserable doing that. Actually making it a less miserable experience is part and parcel with actually making it a bit more accessible to other people, because no one really wants to be walking around in the rain over boulders or something, you know. And I think that's part of how we kind of move beyond what we have been doing. But yeah, I mean, stuff's out there. It's not a new thing. It doesn't, you know, disabled archaeologists haven't just only appeared. We've all been here for a very long time now. So yeah, sorry about the freezing, by the way. The UK has really bad Wi-Fi, apparently. Who knew?
Yeah, so I want to highlight that there's actually some resources that we've gathered that might be of interest, including some of the ones that Alex just mentioned. I'm putting the link in the chat. That's to a Google Drive folder that contains both Teresa O'Mahony's Enabled Archaeology Guide, an article about mental health in the field research team, an article about mitigating chronic diseases in the field, and then Elizabeth Hannigan, who's in the audience today, and I wrote an article about affording field school, which is, of course, a different form of accessibility from disability access. But I want to highlight that that article has in it a table with a list of all of the field school scholarships that we could find information about as of 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Oh my gosh, 3 years ago now that we wrote it. And so there's some information there as well that might be of interest. So please do feel free to go ahead and look at those resources, because yes, as Alex says, this is actually not a new topic. And in fact, I think that there have always been disabled archaeologists, and often the disabled members of our professional communities have been senior archaeologists, like people who started their careers non-disabled but acquired disabilities over time, in part because archaeology can be disabling work. Some of us some people acquire disabilities from the work of doing archaeology, and we've always been more likely to want to accommodate a senior member of the team than who's established themselves in the field than we are to accommodate a newbie, and that's because of the power dynamics of the field. But if you would be willing to have a co-director who is a senior professor and uses a cane, perhaps you should think about whether you would also be willing to have a young student using a cane on your dig, for example. So yeah, this is not new. It's just becoming more common. So I want to open this up to questions from the audience. If you'd like to say a question out loud, if that's accessible to you, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, or just turn on your video and raise your hand, or you can type questions in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can directly chat me and I will read it and not say your name. So yeah, I see we have a question from Phaedra. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, so my name's Phaedra. I'm in my undergrad right now. I'm going to be going into my first field school this summer. I am someone who has kind of a complex range of disabilities. I have neurological issues. I'm neurodivergent, and I also have like blood pressure issues and pain. So I have quite a wide kind of range of issues, which can make stuff difficult to accommodate. Do you guys have any tips as disabled archaeologists of how to be nicer to yourself, that people don't have the stuff that you need? Dev, what you were saying, Kat, about stuff within the US definitely being a lot more accessible and international travel not being great, that absolutely flying is something that is so difficult. And the schools in the US are mostly camping based. They're mostly outside, and they don't have the kind of accommodations that somebody with an autoimmune disease really needs. And the ones that I've looked at, so many that the IRF has done, and the American Archaeology Association, and the ones that are in the US just aren't accessible for me. And how do you guys just have any strategies for dealing with the rejection fatigue of having director after director after director just say that they can't make stuff work for you? Like, how do I navigate that?
Yeah, so 100% going to answer your question, but I think you're like highlighting a really key thing where we as a discipline really need to rethink field schools and both how we're offering them, but also what are we actually training for? Like, what is the purpose of field school?
Yeah, there's so much field school that is like colonial, and there's like so much that like needs to be changed.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is we are imagining a very narrow picture of what archaeology actually is and entails as a career path. And field school obviously is training us in, you know, survey and excavation technique. But the reality is there are so many jobs in archaeology and heritage management and cultural resource management that that's not everybody's day to day. And I think we really need to think about that just as a discipline as a whole. On top of that, I do think we need to get better at offering local field schools, like a program that has archaeology and requires their students to get field school training needs to have a local option, like period. I know at the University of Idaho, we've been really successful offering a field school that's offered during our regular semester at normal class times. Just, you know, downtown at the local high school, we're excavating like the town of Moscow. So doing, you know, campus archaeology field schools or like easily drivable to field schools that can be offered during a normal school year, I really think might be the way of the future. But that's not, as you've said, that's not the case for everybody, and that's not always doable, especially like if you're in downtown New York City. So how do you deal with rejection fatigue? I think one of the things that you potentially consider doing is finding a mentor who can help you advocate. One of the realities of being somebody with an ability difference is that you have to learn how to self-advocate, and that is exhausting. It's exhausting. And finding collaborators, finding, you know, allies who are willing to do some of that work for you is really important. But that takes self-advocating to find a mentor. Like I'm recognizing that the advice I'm giving you is like, oh, this is extra work.
No, yeah, totally. I totally like part of this is like the responsibility of creating field schools that are accessible for students currently does not rest on directors. It rests squarely on the shoulders of disabled students.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that like we have to pave our own way to making these things accessible for ourselves. And so like I had no idea that the University of Idaho did that. That is the coolest thing ever. And I'm so glad that that program has been able to accommodate so many people. But yeah, no, I'm at the University of Washington, and this seminar was recommended to me by Dr. Sarah Gonzalez.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if any of you know, she's so awesome, and has done so much cool work. But I think I'm hoping that I can just bully her into mentoring me.
Tell her Alex says hi.
I will.
And
Thank
Laura.
you. And Laura.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, and there's downsides to this advice, but I think that sometimes finding the field school that meets your access needs first, even if it doesn't quite match your scholarly interests. So we have the example that Mason shared the story of going to Mexico first, even though he's a Mediterranean archaeologist, that then presumably Mason, your advisor, then knew what being in the field with you was like, and then could write letters of recommendation that spoke from not just Mason is so great in the classroom with the accommodations, but also like, here's how I accommodated Mason in the field. And so that's something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so that's something I'm hoping to in the next few years, perhaps not in time for your undergrad career, Phaedra, unfortunately, but I'm hoping to start an accessible field school in Massachusetts. And part of my goal would be like it wouldn't, the site I have in mind is a 19th and 20th century site, and there may be people who are not that interested in that time and place or the particular topics of my research, but we can figure out what accommodations they need. Because as Kat said, the student may not even know what accommodations they need because they haven't experienced fieldwork yet. And then, okay, let's say you want to go be a Greek archaeologist, I can write letters of recommendation that say, like, here's all the great things about this student. And also, like I'm happy to talk to you about what modifications I made to make this accessible to them, and serve as that kind of advocate as well. And so the downside of the advice of find the field school that's accessible before the summer, before the one that's interesting, is that field schools are expensive and they're time intensive. And part of the expense is the time expense, that if you need to work for money over the summer and you can really only afford to take one summer off from working for money in college, telling you to go on a field school somewhere that you're not that isn't where your intellectual passion is crappy advice. And yet it's sort of the best I have, is to try to like get your foot in the door that way. And I'm hopeful that the Disabled Archaeologists Network can also eventually create some training for field school directors. Perhaps we've talked about having like a list of field schools directed by people who are amenable to this, some kind of vetting of field schools, or like, here's who's gone through our training, and creating the resources so that students don't just, like, currently the way you find a field school mostly is the Archaeological Institute of America's website, which has so many, and it's hard to filter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really, that makes it really hard. But my hope is that we can develop some of these resources, although since you're an undergrad now, by the time that gets done, it may be too late. But there are people thinking about this and thinking.
No, yeah, absolutely. I'm planning on staying in the field anyway, so hope I'll be around when stuff happens.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Good luck.
I was just gonna say one more thing, if I may, because I also am very familiar with this rejection fatigue. And I mean, you've heard some excellent sort of how to seek out a field school that doesn't reject you advice, but I found that even when I had those pathways, right, still this idea of the anxiety around that from the rejection fatigue was a lot still, right? And so the thing that kind of helped me was sort of a sense of solidarity. Like, I think the thing the dad does really well right now that I've seen that has been helpful for me is just like a social group for disabled archaeologists, whether they're undergrads, grad students, in tenure track positions, or whatever. We have a reasonably sized social network already of people who are sharing their experiences with one another. And like, that helped me process a lot of my anxiety from all these rejections to, yeah, Laura's got the link right there. Because it was a sense of like, okay, I'm not alone here. There's a lot of us who have sort of fought through this. And I think that the answer to my anxiety was the sense of like solidarity, is that if we can all kind of stand together, I think then the rejections, one, hit less hard, but two, we can find ways to not, to work around those field schools that reject us. So sort of all I can offer you is a sort of sense of solidarity, but it's helped me. So I hope it is at least somewhat helpful.
No, yeah, that is like, I just this past year met another disabled student in my archaeology department, and she's the first other disabled archaeology student I've ever met. And it was, I kind of realized how much I had been missing that, or realized like how much the kind of casual casual kind of ableism by professors was really, really screwing with me. And just having another person who's also dealing with the same stuff can be so helpful and just reassuring.
I see that there's a question in the chat from Sarah Jane Clements. I'm going to read that. I also see that Sarah Rose hand is up, but Sarah Jane says, it tends to be the case in the UK that people have to start off by working in commercial archaeology, doing physical excavations to eventually get a desk-based role. We need to create different entry routes. Is it the same in the US? My first reaction is that basically, yes. I haven't worked in CRM, cultural resource management, which is what we call commercial, basically the same thing as commercial archaeology. But my sense from everyone I've talked to, including my research interviews, who has done CRM, is that yes, you start out as a field tech, and that's excavation, or actually a lot of survey. In the US, it's a ton of survey, but that survey might be hiking 15 miles a day with a shaker screen on your back. And so the desk jobs are more senior, but you have to go through that first. And my sense also in the academic route, which is where I've always been, is that there's something, there are people who build whole careers on lab work, and a lot of disabled people find lab work more accessible for a wide variety of reasons, but you're often taken more seriously if you've also proved yourself as a field archaeologist. And even just having undergraduate programs not have a research experience requirement, but specifically a field school requirement is sort of part of that system. Do other people want to add to that?
I will. So I'm actually teaching Intro to Archaeology right now, and part of the way I run my class is I have archaeology professionals come in and talk to my students about the wide swath of careers in archaeology. And I think, again, there's this really heavy focus on, like, again, traditional roots of, like, to go into the industry side of archaeology, it's only CRM, it's only shovel bumming, it's seasonal, like hard labor work. The reality is, like, there are a lot of place-based jobs that are actually secure, offer things like health insurance benefits through the federal government or through historic preservation sites. So again, just kind of reimagining what an archaeologist actually is I think important. Like, there's nonprofit work, there's education and outreach work. And so it's actually been really nice this semester to have a number of archaeologists come in and talk about, yeah, like, we might go into the field once a month, or like we might go into the field occasionally, but like a lot of my job is lab and report writing, or again, this more place-based work that's like, I go to a site for a day and then I get to go back home. And there's no camping, there's no like removal from my support networks and that side of things. So yes, I think there is an overall average trend towards shovel bumming, but it's important to know there are avenues to archaeology and employment, and good employment, well-paying employment, that are not that.
Yeah, so Sarah Rowe, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. And well, I hate to be this person that's more comment than a question, but I just want to share that for my field school, we've used the Archaeological Skills Self-Evaluation Toolkit. So it's a series of basically, here's this task that archaeologists do in the field. Are you able to do this fully, with some difficulty, with some adjustments? And we ask all of our students to fill those out like on their own. We don't make them give it to us, but we found that it's very helpful for students to identify places where like they may not have thought, sort of like you were saying, Laura, like you didn't think of yourself as having a disability, but here it was an issue that you had with the field experience. And so then we're able to, build in those accommodations, make adjustments, and we've kind of taken the universal design approach to field school as much as we can, right? So if somebody needs a change to be more accessible for them in the field, we just make that change because it makes life easier for everybody. So I just wanted to chime in with that resource because I found it helpful.
And I will add that to our shared Google folder right after this meeting. That should have been in there. So thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I see that Alex Chilkett has a question. Alex, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi. So I'm like Phaedra, also in my undergrad, and I did not realize that like field school like point blank was an option for me until I'm actually in a just on a whim took a intro to disability studies class, and my professor forwarded like this to me. But how the like I know you mentioned like older archaeologists like using like that are cane users. How does like the use of mobility aids work like in the field? Because like, you know, the idea of like walking 15 miles a day, it's like I can walk maybe 2 miles with crutches.
This is again where I say look local. And I do think it's also worth noting that there are field training programs offered through institutions that aren't universities. So there are a number of public volunteer like avocational archaeology training programs offered by state and federal governments that again are drivable. I think that like drivable is a really key thing that and maybe it's because I'm a historical archaeologist that like this is something that is immediately available to the type of research that I do. But yeah, I cannot think of a project that I have done in the US where we couldn't have gotten you out there with wheels. And again, like that it limits the type of archaeology like site that you could potentially work on. But I don't see the use of a mobility aid precluding your ability to engage in archaeological field work. I think it's just finding the right project. Frankly, we've had students with wheelchairs working on our site. And it's just a situation of how do we get you comfortably set up where you could do something like screening or excavating that doesn't require a large amount of movement in between, or also like we've had students who are absolutely fine excavating, but they can't get up to move the buckets to the screen and that sort of thing. And then we just work out a pairing system that we then implement for everybody. I think that's the other part of this too, of like, sometimes the things that are most helpful to our students with ability differences are actually going to be helpful to like the team as a whole. So I think it's totally doable. It's just finding the right project for you.
Yeah, one thing I would look for is excavation more than survey. So survey is going to pedestrian survey, which is usually what we mean by survey, is like walking out across often uneven landscapes, and that's gonna generally involve more kind of hiking. Now some excavation sites you hike to as well, but survey almost like I'm sure there's a way to do it. But just as a like filtering mechanism, that might be a good starting point. Mason, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think these notes about, so I have several mobility devices I need. I walk with cuff arm coaches for short distances, and then in a sort of electric wheelchair scooter for longer ones. And the advice about filtering programs is very good. However, I would also just emphasize that like I've been on programs like, so I've been on survey projects. Actually, I've done survey, and like it is sort of harder than lab work, but it is doable. And the reason I've been able to do it is because I've been sort of frank with the directors about like workshopping how that would work for me. So we would often bring when I did survey, we would often bring like foldable chairs as part of sort of the backpack equipment so that I could take a break. Very lightweight foldable chairs. And so things like that. Like, yes, it is occasionally limiting the sites you can go to, but how I like to frame it is more of like putting the onus on the sort of creativity of the project, right? Is that I think a lot of more sites and projects can work with people with mobility aids than most people think they can. It's just a matter of actually working with the person. And like I said, that kind of goes back to developing a rapport with the director. And I know that's sort of easier said than done. But like there has not been a realm of archaeology that I haven't been able to do yet. There are things I prefer because they're easier for me. I prefer lab work actually, right? But I'm an osteologist too, so I guess that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I would just encourage you to frame it that way. As well. Obviously be realistic with your own ability, but I think most people would be surprised at how the wide range of projects that people with mobility devices can go on if you just make an effort to make it accessible, you know? So
yeah, I also want to say many of the sites I've worked on, some parts of them are closer to a place that you could get a car than others. And often I've worked on projects that have multiple crews working in different locations. So for example, the project I worked on most recently in Mexico, the name of the site is in Nahuatl, on top of the hill, and it's literally on top of a big hill. And we can drive up to the top, but there were residential terraces all the way down the hill. And to get to some of the places I dug, you had to either hike down from the top or hike up from the bottom to get to it. But there were also other crews working right next to the road. And so just because some part of the site is less physically accessible than others doesn't mean that you couldn't like go visit once but not have to hike every day to that spot, or be put on a crew that's working in a specific area. One of the things I like to say about this is on every dig I've ever been on, there are multiple people and different people are doing different tasks, and not every task actually has to be done by every person. And by nature, not every task is done by every person. And so it's all collaborative. And so we should be deciding who's doing which tasks in part based on what they're able to do. And we should be figuring out how to make tasks accessible so that students are able to experience the whole gamut. But I worked on that project. I was paired with another student who had a back injury and couldn't lift a 5-gallon bucket of rainy season wet dirt into the screen. And so I did more of the bucket lifting, and her Spanish was much better than mine since she was a native speaker. And so she checked the grammar on my notes, and it was just like, that worked totally fine. We had different things that we were able to do with our minds and bodies. And like, I think we did a great job together, and all the buckets got screened and all the notes were in readable Spanish. So yeah, so my hope would be that like you can sort of negotiate a combination of doing the things that are more accessible to you and making accessible, getting people to help you make accessible the things that are less accessible. So we are out of time, so I'm going to close us here, but thank you so much for this awesome conversation. Like I said, I'm hoping this is the first in a series. We're hoping to do a panel on applying to graduate school next month, and a panel on preparing to go to the field and taking care of yourself in the field in April. So please keep your eye out for that. And you can join our listserv. I put the link above in the chat. The Disabled Arc Network website has a form to join our listserv. So thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a great day.